Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Kianistan podcast. Before we get started, a very quick update. In my last episode, I expressed concerns on the plight of Yvonne Ridley, an activist who was taken hostage by IDF forces of the Samud flotilla. At the time, we had no news of the whereabouts of Yvonne Ridley, and we also knew that she was, at the time, she was kept in one of the worst and most notorious prisons in Israel, and also she was denied access to her medication, and also I think she was on hunger strike as well. So there was lots of concerns about her whereabouts, her safety. The good news is, unconfirmed news, that Yvonne Ridley is now released. She's safely back with her husband in Istanbul. So I'm really happy to hear that, and hopefully we'll hear from her in due course. And I'm just like to congratulate her family, and I'm sure at this point in time, she would just want us to keep our focus on the people of Gaza and what's going on there. So to start the episode today, I'm very happy to announce we have returning guest, Vanessa Beeley from Beirut, Istanbul. Vanessa, welcome. Thank you for joining us again.
Beirut, Lebanon. I'm not in Istanbul. I wouldn't be allowed in Istanbul.
Sorry. So thank you for joining us. When I woke up this morning, well, I did wake up a bit late, but when I did wake up this morning, there was news about potential deals being taking place in Gaza to do with Gaza. What is the update, the recent update?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would like to say that there's a huge amount of misinformation, of course, circulating regarding Hamas statements, Hamas positions, Trump's statements, which are deliberately misleading at best, insanely deceptive at worst, of course. And I would go for the latter, not the former. So basically we're in a position at the moment. It's not a peace deal. It's not an end to the war by any means. I know I understand that people desperately want peace for the Palestinian people, but in all honesty, while Israel exists, while the Zionist movement exists, not only Netanyahu, there will be no peace either for the Palestinians or for the people of the resistance in the region. And that, of course, includes Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and even further afield, even in areas of Saudi Arabia. We can talk about that. Mm-hmm. And so basically what has currently happened is that there is a ceasefire. That's effectively what has been achieved, is a ceasefire very similar to previous ceasefires, in which there is agreed to be the release of the remaining 48 Zionist hostages, both living and dead, a withdrawal of the Zionist forces from certain positions in Gaza, not a full and total withdrawal, of course. But that's only that's, I think, 1 point on the Trump 20-point peace plan. So when Trump is sort of hailing himself as the savior of the entire region, I think we should take a deep breath and have a look at what is actually happening on the ground. Israel is still bombing. The ceasefire should have taken effect at 12 today, our time. So that was 2 hours ago. Israel is still bombing on the basis that they don't accept the ceasefire until Netanyahu actually issues a statement approving it. So in effect, we're not even, when we haven't even achieved the ceasefire, because Gaza is being extensively bombed right now. People that tried to return to the north from the south have been fired on by Israeli tanks at the Rashid on the Rashid crossing. So we're not by any means out of a violent, aggressive, genocidal situation for the Palestinians. And it's also worth noting that even during the so-called ceasefire talks, the attacks and land grab and ethnic cleansing of the West Bank actually escalated. So while people are focusing on what's happening in Gaza, the attempt to ethnically cleanse the West Bank, what remains of the Palestinian West Bank, of course, by the settler groups has actually increased. And also, if you listen to Eyal Zamir, who's the chief of staff of the Zionist forces, he's actually saying there is no ceasefire. If the political situation, if the political agreement is reached, then we will accept the ceasefire. But for now, they're not in a ceasefire situation as far as he's concerned. So that actually confirms what I've just said. And of course, you've got extremists like Smotrich, the finance minister, Ben-Gvir, who are effectively saying that unless there are assurances that if Hamas won't disarm, which is, of course, part of Trump's 20-point plan, that the resistance should disarm completely and either leave Gaza or, if they remain, promise to allow themselves to be de-radicalized. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are pushing for assurances that if this is not agreed upon, then they will continue the war against the people in Gaza effectively.
Yeah. Thank you for that summary. There's so much to unpack there. It is a very dire situation.
Yeah, yes, it is.
It is a very dire situation, and you're right. I mean, there is no peace for the people in Palestine or the peace for the region as long as Israel exists. You're right. I mean, even the so-called peace that was established between Israel and Lebanon was never respected, and Israel continues to bomb there. Am I right about that?
6,000 violations. There's more than 6,000 violations. I mean,
Yeah.
even last night, they invaded and detonated a whole house. Yesterday, they bombed a cafe, destroyed it completely. About a week ago, they targeted a wife and her husband, but they actually waited for the wife to return to the car, and the guy had actually already been blinded in the pager attack. Which of course was an operation, a Mossad operation that blinded or maimed and mutilated thousands of Lebanese, not necessarily Hezbollah, but their families, their children, their wives. And you know, and the point is, my fear is whenever we see Israel seemingly agree to some kind of ceasefire, what we usually see then is a ramping up of the aggression, not necessarily only in Palestine, but also elsewhere. And we can talk about that. And this is part of the long war. We saw it, as you mentioned, the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel in November, the end of November 2024. What happened immediately afterwards? Within 10 days, Syria was gone. Or Syria, as we know it, was gone. Yeah.
So with that in mind, I mean, because this is not the entire, at the moment, we're just talking even amongst the 20-point plan of what Trump had. We're just talking about the very first phase. And that first phase is to get obviously the Israeli hostages released from Hamas custody, and also a number of Palestinians kept in Israeli custody released. But after that, once those hostages, because that's been a big headache for Netanyahu, because there's been a lot of pressure on him, that anything he's doing, nothing he's doing is actually helping release the hostages, which is one of the main objectives, so-called like objective that he had for his own people. So once those hostages are released, what under the plan, what guarantees are there that Israel is not going to get started again? Because as you say, they're not withdrawing completely from the area. And also, when Trump won presidency, before he even came to office, he was able to establish peace, like a ceasefire then, which didn't last much, very long at all. So what guarantees, are there any guarantees that as soon as the hostages are released, would Israel abide by any of the terms, or would it be in their interest to abide by any of the terms?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand that Netanyahu has never had as a priority to release the hostages. We also have to understand that the Zionist forces were the ones that murdered the majority of the civilians on the 7th of October. That has been admitted by officials, by senior military officials also, that the Hannibal Doctrine was deployed and the helicopters and the tanks were targeting their own people. Then on the 9th or 10th of October in 2023, Hamas first said that they would release all of the hostages if Netanyahu would give his assurances that they wouldn't invade the Gaza Strip. So, I think if we're looking at this realistically, Netanyahu has never, ever prioritized the release of the hostages. And he, of course, and that's according to hostages' testimony, those that have been released, he is actually putting the lives of those hostages in danger with the level of explosives, more than Hiroshima, that have been dropped on Gaza, and the wide-scale devastation of Gaza. In fact, the fact that the resistance factions have kept these hostages alive is quite extraordinary, while their own people are being slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands, not their tens of thousands. Again, that figure is being hugely downplayed. There are multiple reports that are suggesting it's as high as 600,000, between 400 and 600,000. And if you look at the absolute devastation in Gaza, that's not surprising. And the number of people that are probably still buried under the 40 kilometers worth of rubble and destruction, right? And not to mention the potential for the use of chemical weapons and so on that has been deployed by the Zionists. Sorry, I've slightly forgotten the second part of your question.
Yeah, so what guarantees do we have that once the hostages are released, the Israeli hostages, that Israel would have any interest in abiding by the rest of the agreement?
Well, no, there's no assurances whatsoever. And if you actually look at the Trump plan, it is, of course, disproportionately weighted in favor of Israel. I mean, you have to raise the question, who should really be de-radicalized? Who should be disarmed here? Should it be a non-state, an illegitimate occupying force that is using all the weapons under its control to genocide and ethnically cleanse and exterminate an entire people? And that is something that it's been doing for 100 years. Should they be disarmed? Yes, of course they should be. Should the people that are resisting with literally homemade rockets and missiles and their own bravery, that's effectively, because what has brought us to the point of ceasefire? It's not the Arab Gulf countries. It's not Trump. It's not Netanyahu. It's the bravery of the resistance in Palestine. Yes. And if you're going to say, disarm the resistance, disarm the Palestinian people, then you open the floodgates to there being some kind of false flag, some kind of pretext, justification for Netanyahu to finish the job. Look, what happened, for example, when the PLO agreed to disarm? In 1982, there was the massacre of Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila by the Phalangists, who were acting as a proxy for the Zionists, and massacred and raped and burned alive Palestinians. And if you look at when this peace deal has come into effect, it's come into effect, of course, as you have the flotillas, as you mentioned in the beginning, arriving in Gaza, being arrested. It's not one boat. It's hundreds of boats, right? There are mass strikes across Europe. There are mass protests. And when you have Gustave Petro, the president of Colombia at the UN, talking about the Uniting for Peace resolution, which could potentially bring an armed peacekeeping force under the mandate of the UN to Gaza and to the West Bank to end the genocide. It's funny how this peace deal comes in just at this point, right? That's number one. Number two, when we look at the fact that Netanyahu has been basically arming and funding ISIS factions in Gaza to also slaughter the Palestinian people, prevent them receiving aid, and as a weapon against Hamas, just as they did, of course, in Syria. Israel was providing hospital treatment, weapons, air support for the Takfiri elements inside Syria that eventually, with Israel's help and the help of many others, overthrew the Syrian government in December last year. So who's to say if you disarm Hamas, then do you leave Gaza in the hands of ISIS?
Yeah.
That's also another potential scenario. So no, this, in my opinion, we now have the ceasefire, which, thank God, hopefully the Palestinian people in Gaza will receive finally some humanitarian aid, because that's part of the ceasefire agreement, that aid trucks will finally be allowed in, right? So at least there is some respite for the people there. But in my opinion, Hamas would be insane to agree to disarmament or to agree to mass deportation if they accept amnesty. And who's to say that they're not going to get bombed somewhere else? Like if, for example, they go to Qatar or they go to Turkey. We've already seen this. And this is another point. Trump's role is to lure people into these peace traps.
Yes.
Right. If we look back at the assassination of Commander Qasem Soleimani and Commander Abu Mahdi Mohandes, the leader of the PMU, the Iraqi resistance forces, under his first administration in 2020, they were lured to their deaths, believing they were on a diplomatic mission.
Yeah.
In Qatar, Trump effectively lured the Hamas leadership to Qatar for peace negotiations.
Yeah.
Right. So this is what he does. And so therefore, what assurances are there for Hamas members or even for Palestinians that if they leave Gaza and they go somewhere else, that they're not going to be bombed again under some justification?
Exactly.
And we know that the US supports any pretext that's presented by Israel, pretty much.
Yeah. Exactly. Very true. And so the initial peace plan that Trump had, that was that 21-point plan that then later was changed by Israel. One of the things that they did change is that one of the things that it had apparently was that there'll be no more attacks in Doha. And that was also one of the things that was watered down. So that's how much kind of security we can have for those countries as well.
There's no security, and there's absolutely no security for the region, for the entire region either, while Israel exists.
And I think you're absolutely right. The first thing is that I'm really happy that at least now the people in Gaza can hopefully get some respite and get some humanitarian aid. And obviously everyone in the region, around the world, everyone wants to see a final kind of peace there. But no one can trust Israel and no one can trust Trump. Even this so-called plan he has called Eternal Peace, just that name. One of our local graveyards is called Eternal Peace. So, I mean, what does that even mean? And absolutely, I think this whole
sorry. Go on.
Yeah, I was going to say this whole proposal to me is just trying to achieve through this peace plan what they couldn't achieve through 2 years of war, which is basically the defeat of Hamas, and this is nothing else.
But the thing is that, they're not going to defeat Hamas, because even if they wiped out every single member of Hamas, and they've been noticeably useless at doing that. I mean, even in the last few days, there have been major attacks on Zionist forces inside Gaza. So they've been, despite all of their claims of, smashing the resistance. I mean, I don't know if you saw the interview between Netanyahu and Ben Shapiro, when he actually makes the claim that they've smashed all the resistance, they've smashed Hamas, and he says, but we haven't quite finished that yet, but we will finish it. This isn't a man that's negotiating peace, by the way. You know, when he talks about the fact that, well, we got rid of Syria, we've destroyed Hezbollah. They haven't destroyed Hezbollah. They haven't destroyed, because the thing is that the resistance it's an ideology. It's an idea. And we know from history that an idea is never defeated.
Yes.
And when it's an ideology as strong as it is within the resistance in this region, within Hezbollah, within Yemen, it's never going to be destroyed. Yeah. And how many Palestinians do you have still in diaspora that still believe in the right of return, for example? This is a global war. This is not something that people should reduce down to Israel and Palestine. This is a war between the Zionist movement and every state that it's captured, which includes the UK and the US and a large number of EU member states, against all of us, actually, against all humanity. It's not only regional, it's not only Palestinian. And when we look at Trump's messaging, on the other hand, I mean, for example, what has he done in Venezuela? He's ended diplomatic talks in Venezuela. He's withdrawn the envoy, Greenell, right? This is not a president of peace. When he's talking about Iran, he's talking about disrupting Iranian oil exports by basically blockading the Persian Gulf and what else? The Sea of Oman, with the help, of UAE and Bahrain. This isn't a president that's looking for peace. He's looking at ways to expand the war while giving potential respite for Israel to prepare itself for a larger expansion. That's the point. And that's also what he does. When we talked about his method of luring people into a false sense of security, he also did that in Iran. Yeah. The negotiations on the nuclear deal were ongoing when Israel attacked. Right? Exactly. And so we have to look everything in context and certainly not trust Israel. I mean, Israel has never had any interest in peace. We know what the final plan is: total extermination of the Palestinian presence on Palestinian land, the conversion of the territory into the state of Israel, the land of Israel only. When they talk about one state, it's not a Palestinian state. It's the state of Israel. And right now, those countries that are pushing for a two-state solution, this is nonsense. Yes. The two-state solution was considered non-viable even back in 1936. Yes. How is it going to be viable now, particularly after you've disarmed the resistance? So in other words, you want a completely defenseless people living in reduced extermination camps that can potentially be used as slave labor in the proposed free trade zone that Netanyahu and Trump have been working on for the last 2 years. And now you have the introduction again of Jared Kushner at the peace talks. Jared Kushner, of course, is the guy, the son-in-law of Trump, who was talking about developing the waterfront property, etc. So, you know, I just think I understand the emotional reaction towards, as you said, some respite for the Palestinian people. But certainly here in the region, people remain vigilant because they know that the war has not ended.
Yes. Also, so in the past or up until now, Netanyahu has used this excuse that if he gives in, or if he's kind of seen to be negotiating with Hamas, then hardliners like Ben Gvir and Smotrich will topple his government. But apparently now in Israel, the opposition party has come out and said that we will not let your government fall. So don't have that as an excuse. Is that right? Have you had?
I would be very, very surprised. I mean, I've seen statements from Smotrich and Ben Gvir still pushing for these assurances that Hamas will be disarmed or deported, basically. So ethnically cleansed. And the other interesting point in the plan, in the Trump plan, of course, is the reform of the Palestinian Authority, which is quite amusing because the Palestinian Authority, or Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is a complete toady of the Zionist regime anyway. So I'm not quite sure to what extent they can possibly reform him any further, unless they're talking about removing sort of radical elements, as they would describe it, within Fatah or the Palestinian Authority itself. So effectively, there is, I mean, people have talked for some time about there being a potential for some kind of civil war in Israel itself with the extreme right. And I don't believe there's any real left remaining in Israel anyway. I think everyone is center and right and extreme right and fanatical about ending the existence of Palestinians in the territory. And I think something like 82% of Israeli Jews believe that the Palestinian issue should be finished with the final solution, which is the ethnic cleansing. And they're not against the extermination of Palestinians.
Yes.
So, no, I mean, I would be quite surprised, and I would also be very distrustful of any statement of that nature, because, as I said, if you watch the Ben Shapiro interview, the other thing that Netanyahu does is to line up a potential for a false flag, which will be blamed on Iran, because he talks about, first of all, he talks about smashing Iran's nuclear capability. But then literally in the next breath, he talks about the fact that, well, yeah, but we have to destroy their ballistic missile capability because they have atomic weapons aimed at every single city. And he names the cities in the United States that could be targeted by Iranian atomic missiles. Those are his words.
Yes.
So that for me is the clear paving of the way towards a false flag, right? So, as I said, this isn't a man who sees himself as losing the war against the resistance. This is a man who perceives that Israel is expanding very nicely, thank you. And with the US's help, he's very clear about the relationship with President Trump, the greatest friend to Israel. And Trump's entire administration is either Zionist or Christian Zionist. Let's be clear about that also. And so therefore, you know, I think the point is, any of these narratives, for me, one, we have to check that they're not misinformation, because there's a huge amount of misleading narratives being published by certain media outlets right now.
Yeah.
And I think you have to keep an eye on the direction of travel. And in my opinion, the direction of travel is to effectively wipe out, you know, remember his blessings and curse map at the UNGA, where the blessings were, of course, all of the trade partners, the Zionist bloc, as I call them, and the curse were the entire resistance axis countries, both state resistance and non-state actors.
Yes. Vanessa, you've mentioned timing of what's going on a few times, and I think that's really important. And I've been thinking about this as well, and I'm wondering, do you think all of this that's going on may have something to do with the fact that Israel's getting ready to attack Iran again, and they might need to realign their forces or their resources towards that?
Definitely. And I think there's a number of aspects to this. I don't think it's only Iran. And again, I've been speaking to people here in Lebanon, in Syria, also in Iraq. And what seems to be happening, as I said, you know, whenever Israel seems to be overly positive about any kind of ceasefire or peace deal, I immediately become highly suspicious, because this is not in their nature, right? But we've seen through history that usually what happens in Syria was a massive lesson for all of us not to, you know, to pay attention. I remember when the ceasefire came in with Hezbollah, I immediately said they're going to pivot to Syria. But I was expecting, and everyone was expecting, bombing campaigns and so on. No one, in all honesty, expected the speed of the onslaught from the Al-Qaeda groups. But that's another whole story. So effectively, yes. Now, there was again something that Netanyahu said in the Ben Shapiro interview, which also raised raised the alarm for me. He was talking about how Israel shares with the United States both defensive and offensive technology for war, basically. And when he talks about the offensive technology, he said, we've given technology to the United States that no one else has that makes them genuinely a superpower. But of course, he's not going to talk about what that is. Yeah. But I think, my personal opinion, yes, there is a war coming with Iran. They have a very narrow window of opportunity because even from a weather perspective, right now we're entering winter, which will make any kind of operation more difficult. It's not going to make it impossible, but it's going to make it more difficult. So really they have, where are we now? October, November, before in December, winter sets in. Then really there's no time for an operation until after January. Then you've got midterm elections. So when in the US, so when we look at the timing and the opportunity, it's now. The other thing is, and this is something that I've been looking into, when he talked about offensive weapons and offensive capability, everyone knows that Israel has a completely unmonitored nuclear capability. I mean, estimates are between 150, more than 200 nuclear weapons, right? But beyond that, because everyone's very focused on the nuclear threat, although most people talk about it in terms of China or Russia, very few people actually point out that Israel has nuclear weapons. It doesn't adhere to any nuclear proliferation treaty like Iran does. It doesn't allow inspectors into Israel. It's a secret program, right? Even from the US, as far as I understand. But it also has a chemical weapons and bioweapons technology development. And this was really interesting. I started to look into this in the last few days. And in 1948, Ben-Gurion reached out to the Jewish agency in Europe to look for Eastern European scientists and so on to develop what he said was the capacity to kill masses or cure masses. Both are important. That's quoting Ben-Gurion. And that was back in 1948. And we know that since then, the Zionists have deployed chemical weapon use against Palestinians. They've poisoned the wells, for example, during the Nakba. The settlers are continuously poisoning the land or the water wells of the Palestinians. The use of white phosphorus, which has contaminated soil for hundreds of years and will continue to do so. The potential use of depleted uranium in the massive bombing campaigns in Gaza, for example, right? All of this has been ongoing, and we don't know what else they've been introducing into the water systems in Gaza because everything is controlled by the Zionists, the same in the West Bank, the same in the occupied territories. Palestinians don't have the right to their own water sources. They've been pouring at least their sewage into the sea off Gaza, but who knows what else they've been pouring in there, right? The rates of cancer have soared, for example, in Gaza. So this has been ongoing. So in my opinion, and again, I've been speaking to people here, there is unfortunately potential for there being a new kind of warfare used by the Zionists to finish the job. And the job is the end of the resistance, the end of any kind of military threat to the national security of Israel for centuries, not just for the next 10 years, but forever. So at the same time, the US is withdrawing troops from Iraq. Why are they withdrawing troops from Iraq now? Right now. So what is Israel going to be using in Iraq against the resistance factions? What might it use in Lebanon, right, in the south? At the same time, the Takfiri elements under the sort of presidency, if you want to call it that, of Jolani, there are reports of tens of thousands of Takfiri, particularly foreign Takfiri fighters on the border with Lebanon. And there has been chatter already of using these Takfiri elements to invade the eastern and northern borders of Lebanon. That combined with an Israeli invasion in the south or an Israeli bioweapon attack in the south, we don't know. At the same time, also Yemen, there's potential for something there. And as you said, Iran. So I think if I have to predict, the region is going to face a very dark time in the very near future. And that's my opinion based on what I'm hearing from people here who understand the strategy.
Vanessa, this is terrifying.
Yeah,
So
it is.
I was actually thinking about this because I was spoken to like a number of analysts about the fact that so all the constraints that Israel had before in that June war that went on for 12 days, the fact that Iran is so much bigger than Iraq, the fact that there's this mountainous terrain, the fact that there's a huge distance. So all of these things still exist, which means that USA or even Israel cannot bring in ground forces and like properly invade Iran. So the best that they can do is do like a similar attack that they did previously. But then they know what happened previously in return. So there must be something different that they're planning this time around. It would be complete insanity to just try and do the same again when they got hammered so badly last time. And in view of that, I think what you're saying makes a lot more sense because that's what I was worried about as well. Tactical nuclear weapons, or I didn't actually think about chemical weapons. But I think there must be something like that in the pipeline. And it's hugely terrifying, but it makes sense in the scenario that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I tend to look at the 12-day war as a test run. I think Israel was testing its capability. It was testing the reaction of the Iranian people. It was testing whether it would be possible to actually generate some kind of regime change movement. I think that was pretty much demonstrated to not be possible at that time. But I think also if you go back to a 2015 interview with Jolani, when he talked about, and of course it's not, when I say Jolani, it's him channeling the strategy of his handlers, and his handlers are the Zionists or the entire Zionist bloc, right?
Yes.
So including Mossad, MI6, CIA, MIT, etc., are using him as a tool, as a puppet, basically.
Yeah.
And he talked about his job was to cut the hands of the resistance and to establish a Takfiri army, both inside and outside Iran, that could eventually be triggered to bring Iran down. Now, that's another part of the plan that we've potentially not considered, is to what extent are there elements still inside Iran that were not triggered in the 12-day war, which is, as I said, I see it as having been a test run to see the lay of the land, to see how Iran would react, to understand where the weak points are, where they could potentially increase the possibility of success, etc., or where there were failures. Right? This is, we have to remember we're dealing with an entity which is the Zionist movement, which is an expert. As much as we hate it, we have to accept that they're an expert at strategy and manipulation.
Yes. And
they were trained by the British.
Yes.
Yes. So they have no conscience. They have no morality. They have no humanity, actually. And those that are now being harnessed to work for them are the same. If you look at Keir Starmer in the UK, if you look at the majority of the leaders now across Europe, they're ineffective as statespeople, but they're very good puppets for the Zionist movement, and they're doing as they're told effectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're right. I don't think it's possible. They're not going to just repeat what they did in the 12-day war. And but the one thing is, we always talk about it from a in a sense a bit of a one-sided perspective. I would hope that Iran and the leadership in Iran, and by that I'm talking the IRGC, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and so on, that they are well aware of this, and that the intelligence is working to root out any potential areas where there could be a degree of Zionist infiltration and so on. But I think, yes, we have to be prepared. The next war is not going to be the same as the 12-day war. And I keep coming back to this, but Syria must have taught us this lesson. The level of betrayal in Syria, the level of after 14 years of the Syrian army rejecting and defeating the Takfiri project, led by more than 80 countries in the world today. And one last thing to add, those countries that I consider to be part of the Zionist bloc, so that includes Jordan, it includes Egypt, it includes Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. We should remember that Saudi Arabia was created by the British in order to support the Zionist project. Right? I mean, if people don't know the history of that, I mean, Lawrence Arabia was part of it, the Darwin Treaty. So effectively, they gave, I won't go into the whole history because it's quite complex, but they gave Ibn Saud the whole of Saudi Arabia effectively after they harnessed the other two leaders or areas of Saudi Arabia to defeat the Ottoman Empire. They then betrayed them completely and gave Ibn Saud the control of Saudi Arabia in order to protect the Zionist entity going forward. And the same with UAE and Qatar, the same. So when I look at those countries, what they also have to understand is they're not going to be allowed to maintain a military defense or offense force either, and Egypt in particular, because the Egyptian population, the huge majority, I would say, is against what is happening, but they're terrified of Sisi and the military dictatorship. But that's not to say that might not change at some point in the future. So Israel's not going to allow that to remain on its borders. So all of these countries that believe that they've signed some kind of normalization deal with Israel are at threat, under threat also.
Yes, absolutely. You're right about all of those things, and especially Egypt. There's been a lot of talk about how Egypt is getting closer to Turkey and they're forming some kind of a potential alliance. But I was thinking there's no way the Zionist bloc would let Egypt fall out of their control, because Egypt is just too important.
Turkey also is not going to be allowed. I mean, yeah. And if we look at what's happening to Turkey, I mean, Turkey fell into a trap in Syria. It fell in, Erdogan, with all his hubris, fell into a trap set for him by the British, the Americans, and the Israelis. Because now what has happened, he expended vast wealth on the regime change war inside Syria. He backed the terrorist groups. He supported Jolani inside Idlib. And now what's happened? He's basically blockaded in the north, because every time he tries to expand into central Syria or even into the coastal areas, Israel's bombing him. Israel's doing the deals now with Russia in collaboration with Washington to expand their influence in Syria. And even the fact that they're weaponizing the Kurdish separatists in the northeast is effectively weaponizing them against Erdogan's neo-Ottoman expansionist ambitions, right? So when we talk about Turkey's also under threat, because let's, for example, imagine that Israel succeeds, as it is doing right now, in taking control of southern Syria, expanding up the eastern corridor through the David's corridor into the Kurdish-held territory, and then eventually into Iraq. Turkey then becomes a threat to Israel directly.
Yeah.
So at what point, do we see Turkey then also in the crosshairs of Washington and Russia and Israel? Because Russia, let's remember it has a long record of Turkish betrayals, particularly in Syria. So, for Russia, revenge is a dish best served cold. And Russia has traditionally had, particularly under Putin, a very friendly relationship with Israel. And that's now becoming very apparent in Syria.
Yes, I wanted to actually talk to you about this, the Russian and Israeli connection as well. How dangerous is that for countries like Iran? If Iran was attacked again by Israel, is there anything that they can rely on Russia to help? Obviously, I'm not talking about boots on the ground, but intelligence, equipment, anything. Or do you think Russia?
The problem is that the strategic.
Sorry, for Russia and even for China, wouldn't they think that Iran is probably the last domino to fall before the West turns completely towards Russia and China?
I have a slightly different view that I'm getting a lot of stick for on social media, because I don't perceive Russia and China as being some kind of ideological counterweight to the West or some kind of anti-imperialist bloc. That means also I don't see BRICS as some kind of genuinely anti-imperialist bloc. If they were, the countries within BRICS would have imposed economic boycotts on the genocidal entity a long time ago. They wouldn't be increasing trade and arms supply and the supply of oil, which is being facilitated, for example, by Russia through Kazakhstan, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into huge details on that, but it's very clear that were they genuinely in favor of a resistance axis, or were genuinely in favor of ending the neocolonialism of the West and of the Zionist bloc, then at the very least they would be doing is ending all trade with Israel, ending all investment in Israel, right? And Ayatollah Khamenei said this very clearly, and he was actually directly addressing his statement to the members of BRICS. Of course, Iran is the one member that I don't include in my criticism. When he said, every country, Muslim and non-Muslim, must quarantine the genocidal entity. And he's absolutely right. But we've seen complete inaction from Russia or China. But I think we come back to this. It's interesting because I was talking to someone from Iran very recently here. I think Iran has a very realistic view, just as Saeed Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who was assassinated by Israel last year. They appreciate what Russia has done in certain circumstances, but they don't perceive Russia to be an ally.
Yeah.
I think the resistance axis, including Yemen, see both China and Russia as a realistic, pragmatic counter to the West. And particularly when all these countries are under sanctions, then of course they welcome any economic outreach from these countries.
Yeah.
At the same time, Iran has maintained a strategic military independence. And the important part is that their strategic partnership deal doesn't include a mutual defense pact like it does between Russia and North Korea. Russia has signed a deal saying it will come to the defense of North Korea, if it comes under attack. There's no such clause in the deal with Iran. So very clearly, Russia is saying, I'm hands off if there's a war between Iran and Israel. That doesn't mean to say they're not going to supply technology or sorry.
I'm so sorry. Isn't it the case that Russians say that we offered that such a deal to Iran, but Iran refused it?
Look, I think that's Russian sort of diplomatic doublespeak, in my opinion. I think there is potential that Iran is saying, no, we don't want to get too far into bed with Russia, because after what happened in Syria, we understand the role of Russia. At the same time, economically, as I said, they need Russia. And they're perfectly happy to collaborate with Russia on, for example, the economic corridors, the exploration of gas, and so on. Whether Russia actually comes through with those kind of deals remains to be seen also, because they had similar deals in Syria, which they never really completed or enabled. Like, they had the exclusive rights to the oil and gas reserves in Syria. They never exploited them. The whole sort of, 10 years that they were in Syria actively helping Bashar al-Assad to remain in power, they never exploited them, and exploiting them would have led to some relief for the Syrian people from the occupation of their resources and effectively the siege and blockade that was imposed upon them by Western sanctions, right? So I think Iran has a very realistic view. I don't think it relies on Russia, despite, of course, there are statements flying backwards and forwards, but I think at the end of the day, they don't rely on Russia, but they make use of the partnership. So I think that's how I look at it, very much the same way when I look at Yemen and China, for example. I think Yemen or Ansarullah fully understand their history with China and Russia. China, at the end of the day, was very helpful to the Saudi puppet regime that's now residing in the south of Yemen. China was very happy to buy oil from the Saudi puppet regime, so depriving Ansarullah of income from that oil. They recognized the Saudi puppet regime through UN Resolution 2216, and they also approved UN 2624, which designated Ansarullah a terrorist organization. So did Russia. So I think the problem is a lot of people live in this kind of BRICS romance, where they perceive that BRICS is this wonderful ideological counterweight to the neocolonialism of the West. Unfortunately, I don't think that's entirely true. I think they may offer advantages in some ways, but ultimately, if America were, for example, to offer Putin a deal, he'd take it. A deal that sort of he considered to be lucrative enough or good enough for his own country's national security and so on, he would take it. And there's been statements, anyway, from Russia intimating that they're quite happy to actually, be in bed with the West again. So I think the resistance axis is more realistic about this than people in the West are, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with that. And I think I see like three reasons that Iran wouldn't have taken that deal if it was offered from Russia. Firstly, I think at the time they were confident that they can take on Israel by themselves. Secondly, I think Iran likes to have independence. They don't want to get tied down by such a deal. And thirdly, as you said, I think there's no guarantee that when their backs were against the wall, Russia, even with an agreement, Russia would actually come to their defense. So what would be the worth of such an agreement?
As I said, they saw what happened in Syria, and I think that was a huge, not necessarily a shock, but I think it was a big lesson for the region.
Vanessa, talking about, you mentioned people romantically like to try and find something in the BRICS that possibly doesn't exist. So talking about romanticism, what do you think about this deal that's taken place between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan?
We talked about this very briefly, I know, before the interview. I mean, look, I'm not an expert on Pakistan. Yeah, I don't pretend to be. But again, if I look at what happened in Syria, in the 2 years before the government was finally toppled, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were very much used as outreach agents. And that was also at the behest of Russia, by the way. Russia was pushing Bashar al-Assad to pivot towards the Gulf states, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, and away from really the resistance from Iran and Hezbollah. And actually, when was it? 2023, the Ansarullah embassy in Damascus was closed as a result of pressure from Saudi Arabia. So it was very clear. And by the way, when 7th of October happened, we were told at Syria TV, I can, say this now quite openly, we were told that we weren't allowed to criticize Saudi Arabia. So, Saudi Arabia for me is a weapon of empire. And so I'm immediately very skeptical of any kind of approach by Saudi Arabia, because when I look at what happened in Syria, that's what they're used for, to bring in the influence of the Zionist bloc into whatever country that they basically try to infiltrate through whatever deals that they want to do. So that is how I would view it. As I said, I'm not enough of an expert on Pakistan. I know that there has been infiltration, of course, from Saudi Arabia, just as there has actually globally, to introduce the Wahhabi doctrine through the madrasas, through the schools, the religious schools, and so on. So I tend to see Saudi Arabia as a Trojan horse. So I'm very usually very worried when I see them get involved in any way.
I agree. There was a lot of pressure on Pakistan before this war in Gaza started to normalize with Israel because Pakistan doesn't accept Israel as a state. And there was a lot of pressure to first of all recognize. And I think for us, one of the benefits of this whole episode was that those people within Pakistan who were thinking, yes, if we normalize relations with Israel, things will improve because we'll have leverage and all sorts of nonsense kind of reasoning. I think you've given us enough realism to keep us awake for many nights now. Before we go, give us a bit of hopium, like give us something positive to go with.
I don't really believe in hopium because I think that's literally the hopium of the masses. I think, when you mention realism, and I get accused all the time of blackpilling and all the rest of it, but actually for me, full understanding is liberation, because the problem is, I think, why a lot of people in the West do kind of put so much hope in this BRICS vision or whatever alternative vision they're looking at, is because of the level of helplessness that they're being forced into in their own countries in the West. We've seen an increasing kind of police state scenario, particularly in the UK, particularly over what's happened since October the 7th, right? With the arrests of people that are speaking out, the prescribing of Palestine action, etc., etc. So I think people kind of look outside of their own environment for some kind of savior, and that's the problem. That's what we have to stop doing. We have to understand that we're the solution to our problems, and that a revolution doesn't begin with a majority; it begins with a minority throughout history. And so we have to stop abrogating responsibility and start taking responsibility for changing things ourselves. And we've seen it can be done. We've seen what's happened in Italy, across Spain, and so on. And yeah, of course, there are consequences for this, but the consequences of doing nothing are far worse. And from my perspective, look, I live in a region where a resistance exists, an armed resistance exists. And that's one reason that even after Syria fell, I wouldn't come back to the West. Because at least here I feel that there's one, a level of understanding, two, a level of protection that doesn't yet exist fully in the West or against the common enemy. So I am optimistic that there is potential for people when faced with such satanic inhumanity as we're witnessing in the world today, that is being revealed on a daily, hourly basis, that when their backs are really against the wall, they're going to understand that they have to do something. So I am, I am relatively optimistic. I'm certainly optimistic. I don't think things are going to get better. In all honesty, I really don't. But I think the important thing, you call it realism, but the important thing is for people to understand the size of the threat and to realize that they have to prepare for it. That's what is extremely important for me. And for me personally also to understand, right?
Yeah. Esther, thank you so much for your time. It's always a huge pleasure to speak with you. Really, the clarity and the objective analysis that you bring to us is very unique, and it might be not pleasant to hear at times. But every time I speak with you, I love speaking with you because I go away with so many things to think about, food for thought, and so many things to further investigate. Because unfortunately, closing our eyes to reality isn't going to remove the threat and the danger that we're under. Understanding these things is the first step to doing something about it, as you said. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And I'd love to have you back soon. Before you go, I think you do have a blog as well, don't you? Where people may be able to follow you?
Yeah, people can follow me on Substack. Just do a search on Vanessa Beeley, Substack. I'm on Telegram, YouTube, X, when I can be bothered to deal with the nightmare that is X. But mostly on Substack. I'm also on Patreon, but Substack's the main one at the moment, until of course it gets taken over by the Zionists and shut down. But for now, it's surviving.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, if you like, you can share the links with me, and I'll put them in the show notes as well. And I'm sure people would love to follow your work.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you so
having
much.
me on. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Pleasure's mine, and see you next time. Have a lovely day. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of.